Assessing the performance of our students in an objective and unbiased way is always important, but never more so as we continue to work through a range of evidence in order to determine final grades for summer 2021. The responsibility put on teachers and centres this year is not to be taken lightly. Unlike the process of awarding grades in 2020, where we were given very little notice to award grades based on what we thought students would have achieved had they taken the exams, this year schools and colleges must determine what levels students are working at and award the final levels, basing decisions on evidence that they have available. With this in mind, much emphasis is being put on the importance of ensuring objectivity throughout each stage of the process. So let's just be clear. What exactly do we mean when we talk about objectivity? Well, the simple definition of objective is that a person or their judgment should not be influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. No teacher or school would intentionally allow their own bias to influence their decision making when awarding grades to their students. However, to what extent do you consider your own bias when marking and assessing student work? How conscious are you about checking yourself to ensure that judgments that you make, particularly in awarding grades this summer, are fully objective? Unconscious bias is not something that we are necessarily aware of. If it were, it wouldn't be unconscious. Therefore, as teachers, with the support of our schools, we need to have systems in place to help us to be aware of our own bias and ensure that we focus our decision making on the evidence that we have to hand, along with following systems and processes that will continue to help us review our judgments and identify any bias that may creep in. We have a duty to ensure that such processes are in place in order to uphold our value of equality for all, whilst also ensuring that we avoid discrimination as set out in the Equality Act of 2010. The national guidance for awarding the grades this year is clear. Judgments should be made based on records and evidence that demonstrate the student's performance in relation to the subject content that they have been taught. Other factors should not affect this judgment. These include characteristics protected under equalities legislation, such as student sex, race and ethnicity, religion and belief, disability status, gender reassignment, or sexual orientation. These also include factors such as social background, including culture or family, social economic status, or perceived English language proficiency, where this is not relevant to the knowledge, skills and understanding being assessed. The guidance goes on to say that judgments should not be affected by a student's behaviour, positive or negative, character or personality, appearance, performance of a sibling, parental opinions, or the knowledge of grades needed to meet a university offer. Without always realising it, everyone holds unconscious beliefs about others. The first and probably most important step in ensuring that we tackle these biases is to be aware of them. So let's take a few moments to look at some of the most common that we as teachers may be susceptible to. First up is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you notice only evidence about a student that fits with pre-existing views about them. For instance, if you have a student who presents themselves as a hard-working, able student, we could easily assume that the work that they produce is consistently of a high standard, without taking into account a representative body of work that backs this up. In confirmation bias, our perception of the student is influencing our judgment of their ability rather than the actual work that they've completed. Likewise, the halo effect can mean that a particularly positive impression of a student overly accentuates their actual knowledge, skills and ability. Think about a model student. They are polite, respectful, They work hard, meet all deadlines, and their behaviour is always impeccable. Does this mean that they are the highest performing student in the class? Perhaps, but not necessarily. Consider, what does the evidence available tell us about their performance in comparison to the other students? Within halo effect, the opposite can also be true. Where you encounter a student who presents themselves in a negative way, maybe they are disruptive, disrespectful, perceived to be lazy and fail to meet the high expectations that you set for them. Does this mean that the work that they produce is of a lower standard than others in the class whose behaviour is more positive? A negative attitude of learning is not a reflection of the ability of the student or the standard that the student is working at. Though it can affect all subject areas, as a teacher of a practical subject, I need to be particularly aware of the next bias: selective perceptions. This is where undue weight is given to a student's performance on a particular piece of work. As a drama teacher, imagine that I have the next Judi Dench or Viola Davis in my class. When acting, they are nothing short of brilliant. However, perhaps the student struggles with the written element of the course and is only able to produce written work that meets, say, a quarter of the assessment criteria in place. Whilst there's no escaping the brilliance of the student's talent, the evidence of their practical accomplishments cannot outweigh the awarding body's focus on the written work. A full range of evidence should be reviewed that reflects all elements of the course, meaning that in some cases a much less dynamic performer who is consistently meeting all elements of the assessment criteria should be awarded a higher final grade than your acting prodigy. The potential of allowing exception effects to creep in should also be considered. This is when a teacher under or overgrades a student's performance when it is significantly out of line with other students in a group. For example, imagine that I've marked a set of A-level assessments. Nearly every student in the class has achieved either a grade B or C. However, I have two outliers. One student's work is a lot stronger, and one student's work is a lot weaker. Exception effect could mean that automatically I give the stronger student a much better grade, say an A star. It is, after all, stronger than the work that has been produced by my grade B students. Whereas for the weaker piece of work, I give the grade E. Consider what I'm basing that standardising on. Is the stronger piece of work that much higher than the average? And is the weaker piece that much lower? How can I ensure that I am fully objective when marking these assessments? Some of the other things to be considered, though this is not an exhaustive list, are affinity bias, which is when we have a more favourable impression of a student's performance because the student or their qualities and attributes are relatable or similar to one's own qualities and attributes. Primacy effects give undue weight to the first impression of a student, whereas recency effects give undue weight to the most recent interaction that you've had with a student. Contrast effects are where you overestimate a student's likely performance, having first considered a large number of students who are all working at a much lower standard. And finally, conformity bias places undue weight on the opinions of others where these are not necessarily supported by the evidence. Some of the measures that we as a school have put into place to support teachers to ensure objectivity when awarding grades include anonymising in-class assessments by asking students to write their candidate numbers rather than their names on the front of their work. This means that the teacher is able to blind mark the assessments. Cross-team marking, where possible sharing the marking across different colleagues within your team, so that it is not all being assessed by the classroom teacher. Team moderation and standardisation, working collaboratively under the guidance of the curriculum leader to review the student performance and, where necessary, make adjustments so that the standards are consistent across the cohort.
data reviews, using data informed by grade boundaries to help to determine grades. This data can then be compared with the JCQ grade descriptors before the final grades are determined. Sampling of student work, reviewing the work and grades of both random students and targeted students, such as students with special educational needs, to ensure that grades have been awarded objectively based on the evidence available. Whilst it is imperative that we ensure objectivity in the awarding of grades for the summer 2021, it is also necessary to continue to reflect on our own bias in all the work that we as teachers do to ensure equality for all is truly at the core of everything we do.